welcome to our wonderful evening tonight. Thank you so much for supporting us, and thank you for not running away after the fireworks. It was Bryn who set it off, actually. The food, the wonderful food, was provided by the Blue Window, so don't forget to support local people. Also, drinks are provided by Bathtub Road Brewery Co-op. And again, you guys have made this possible. So really, thank you for supporting Los Alamos Historical Society and the Oppenheimer House. So tonight we've got some great people up here. We've got Brye Steeves from Lamo. We have Kai Bird, author of American Prometheus. Tim Rieser, Tim Rieser, who's congressional.
I've worked in the Senate for 37 years.
Before I make any more of a fool out of myself, I'm going to go ahead and turn the microphone over to Sherry, our board president. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you, Todd. I'm Sherry Trottier. I am, right now, my main role is going to be chair of the Oppenheimer House. And we thank all of you for being here this evening and supporting our fundraising effort for the house. I'm going to take a minute to talk about the house for a little bit. Not everyone knows the details here, but we acquired the Oppenheimer House a couple of years ago, and our sweet beauty requires between $1.5 and $2 million to do all the necessary repairs. And with that large sum, we have broken it into different levels. And so our first phase includes taking care of the foundation and the electrical needs. Now, this isn't just your ordinary foundation repair. It entails taking out each board of our hardwood floor, then digging out by hand, in some places, a couple of feet of dirt because there is no crawl space, then repairing the supporting beam that has been eaten by the very hungry termites at some time, and then pouring a stem wall around the living room, the study, and the Oppenheimer bedroom. And just a note, part of the Oppenheimer bedroom no longer has any foundation, so it's kind of important to fix that. And then, of course, the electrical. As you know, with old houses, when you have those wonderful fuses where you put a copper penny in and cloth-covered wiring. So that first phase of work, the plans were recently approved by the county. So the next step is taking it out to bid with somebody that does have experience with historical buildings. And I would like to recognize this evening, we're really happy to have three people, Sean Evans and Drew McMillan, and I'm not sure who the third person is from. Most of you know the company as AOS, it's now MASS, but they are the historic architects from Santa Fe that have been walking us through this process step by step. One other person that I want to recognize, Roger Waterman and his wife Emily McGay. Roger was our president at the time that all of this started, and if you know Roger, he always had Rogerisms, and oops, Roger. And so one of the things he said at one point was, well, put your money where your mouth is, in terms of you want to get this project going. And he and Emily made the initial very generous donation that started the Oppenheimer Fund. And many of you in this room, you have supported that project with your donations, and we appreciate it because it has brought us now to first phase, where we can start that first phase of repair. I also want to thank Tim and Kai because they also recognize the importance of funding this project that will become a museum dedicated to J. Robert Oppenheimer and telling that incredible story. And so for them to get their schedules coordinated and join us, it really means a lot to us to have them here. So if there is anybody who doesn't know who Kai Bird is, I will tell you. Kai Bird is a Pulitzer Prize winning historian who has published biographies of John McCloy, Victor Bundy, and of course J. Robert Oppenheimer from the book American Prometheus. Kai's father was a U.S. Foreign Service officer. He spent his childhood in several cities in the Middle East. He also has authored a memoir about his childhood in the Middle East. He received his BA from Carleton College and an MS in journalism from Northwestern University. He's the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. We are very pleased to have Tim Rieser with us. He attended Stanford University and Dartmouth, receiving his BA from Dartmouth. He received his JD from Antioch School of Law. He worked as a public defender in Vermont, his home state, and then spent a year teaching as a teaching assistant at the Harvard Law School project on negotiation. In 1985, he began working for former Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont, who served for 8 terms as President Pro Tem and Chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee. He served as a senior advisor to the Chairman of the Appropriations Committee in 2023, and from 1995 to 2023, Tim also served as Senator Leahy's senior foreign policy advisor. What is not in this bio, and what we learned, is that his parents came here to the Manhattan Project when they were 22 years old. His father was a physicist, and his mom worked at the preschool. And we all know that picture we have seen of Poppy rocking Peter, and we're assuming it's the same preschool. Our moderator this evening is Brye Steeves. We are so happy to have you with us. Brye is the director of the National Security Research Center. The NSRC is the lab's classified library that serves researchers across LANEL's weapons program, the National Nuclear Security Enterprise, and beyond. As director, she's responsible for strategic planning, program management, internal and external partnerships, ensuring that the NSRC continues to grow as a core competency for Los Alamos. Previously, she was the head of communications for the NSRC. She has a bachelor's degree in journalism, master's degree in international relations. She has worked at 3 daily newspapers and editor for a publishing company in Seoul, South Korea. And she has worked on monetary policies and socio-economic messaging for the Federal Reserve, and most recently, the nuclear deterrent messaging for the Department of Defense. And so at this time, Brye will be our moderator, and again, welcome Kai and Tim.
Hello, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. Sherry, thank you for that introduction, and also thank you for the invitation to be here this evening. It's an honor. As Sherry mentioned, I'm the director of LANEL's National Security Research Center. My organization, the NSRC, actually was Oppenheimer's wartime technical library. We started in 1943. We're here 80 years later, still working to serve our nation's, our world's national security needs. We have grown. We now have over 15 million classified and unclassified materials. So we think that Oppenheimer would be pretty proud. We are definitely still fascinated by him, by this man, our first lab director. I think this is a sentiment that you will leave here this evening also feeling, of course in part because of our subject that we're discussing tonight, Oppenheimer, but also because of these 2 fascinating individuals joining us today. I spent a little bit of time few days, and I think you'll enjoy their stories just as much as I have. To get started, Kai, Tim, can you please describe your connection to Oppenheimer as his biographer, and Tim as the son of Manhattan Project-era scientist who worked for Oppie?
Yes, I'm only here because in the year 2000, Marty Sherwood came to me, and he had been working on Oppenheimer since 1980. He had signed a contract in that year with Knopf to do a biography of Robert Oppenheimer. And he spent the next 20 years doing magnificent research, accumulating 50,000 pages of archival documents. And then he came to me in the year 2000, and we've become friends over the years, and colleagues. And he came to me and he said, Kai, I want you to join me on my Oppenheimer project. And if you refuse, my gravestone is going to read, he took it with him. Marty was a very funny guy. He had a good sense of humor. But he was a terrific historian, just a wonderful researcher, and a great writer. But he had gotten biographer's disease, and this is common in business. You get obsessed with your subject, and you can't stop the research, and you can't start writing because you always think there's one more archive to go to, one more interview to do. And anyway, it turned into a fantastic collaboration. He knew the materials very well, and I started to write, and then he started to write, and we went back and forth, and we finished the book in 4 years, and then it took another year of rewriting and editing before it came out in 2005. And that's a long time ago. I can hardly remember what I wrote, but it won the Pulitzer the next year, and now, in America, it's having a second life. So I guess I'll end on that note. Tim, it's your...
So first of all, thank you all for coming. I and Kai and a few others had the chance to spend a few minutes in Oppenheimer's house this afternoon, and I really can't think of a more worthy cause than to preserve that building for future generations. It really is a place that everyone should experience. You really feel his presence there, and so it's really great for us to be able to be part of this. First of all, it would be hard to overstate how much it means to me to be here, as I think will become clear. But also just how utterly improbable it is that I am here and that I'm here with Kai. As Sherry mentioned, my parents, 79 years ago, at the age of 22, shortly after my father enlisted in the Army, were told to report to 109 East Palace Avenue. He was a physicist. There weren't that many then, and certainly not nuclear physicists. And so he was someone who the Army recognized could contribute in some way. And he was sent here. They both came. They had no idea where they were going. They really didn't even know what they were getting into. Although he had been working at the University of Chicago, where the first chain reaction occurred. And so, he had an inkling. But I will save some for later, but suffice it to say that their time here was probably among, if not the most memorable 2 years of their lives. And one of the reasons was Robert Oppenheimer, who they revered, as did most other, if not all other scientists who had the opportunity to work here under his direction. And so, I was too young to ever know Oppenheimer, although when I typed in my father's name and Robert Oppenheimer into the computer, what came out was a letter sent by my father to Robert Oppenheimer this was after the war in the 1950s, inviting him to speak at Dartmouth College, where my father was a lowly professor of physics, instructor of physics. And so growing up, I heard about Oppenheimer. I didn't know enough to ask the questions that I wish I'd asked, and it's now too late. But I, thanks to Kai, have learned a lot more, and that's how I got involved in this.
I think that's a nice segue, Tim, to my next question for Kai. Let's talk a little bit about Oppenheimer as a person. He's described in so many ways. I think the adjective that quite frequently used is complicated, right? He's a complicated man. But then you hear time and again of his charm, his charisma, his sparkling blue eyes, the reverence that people felt toward him. Can you talk a little bit about Oppenheimer as a person, and why are we still today so intrigued by him and still drawn to his story?
Well, I think we're intrigued because he's a huge historic icon, the father of the atomic bomb. But when you read American Prometheus, and you all who grew up like Tim did, knowing about Poppy in this special little place called Los Alamos, everyone understood that he was very human. And you know, in the book, we make a big effort to humanize this historical icon. And partly, you know, that we tell the story of his childhood, which was a very privileged childhood, and growing up in a 10-room apartment in the Upper West Side, having a chauffeur-driven car, a small sailboat that you could sail on Long Island Sound, going to a private school called the Ethical Culture School. And yet he was also a painfully awkward socially young man with a long, he had a long, prolonged adolescence, and he was awkward, and he was painfully aware of his own awkwardness. And he got tuberculosis as a teenager, and for that reason, his parents sent him out to New Mexico. And that's why he ended up here as a 17, 18-year-old. And he fell in love with New Mexico. And yet he was, you know, this skinny little kid from New York City who loved horseback riding and the Spartan life of the Pecos Mountains, and yet he was obviously fragile, and I don't know. We opened the book, I want to say we opened the book with an anecdote from 1954, just after Poppy has been handed the letter of indictment, and by Louis Strauss, the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, who was orchestrating his downfall. And Poppy was given the chance to walk away, but he had decided he was going to fight this, and he immediately takes the letter of indictment and goes to his lawyer's office in Washington, D.C., which is bugged. And his conversation with his lawyer is overheard by the authorities. And then he goes to the Georgetown home of his one of his old friends, and he has a drink, and we think he took a sleeping pill or something, and then he went up to the bathroom, and suddenly there was an enormous crash, and his wife, Kitty, rushes to the bathroom door, and Ann Wilson, his the last secretary of his at Los Alamos, was present. They were pushing the door open, and he's collapsed, he's unconscious on the bathroom floor. And you know, the story shows how vulnerable he was. He was obviously full of anxiety about what he had just been informed of, and it's just a very human story. He was the father of the atomic bomb, but he was extremely vulnerable. And throughout the book, we attempted to emphasize his humanity and his awareness of all our fragilities, and the fact that this is a man who was capable of transforming himself repeatedly, and yet he was always aware and empathetic with the human condition.
I was wondering if either one of you wanted to comment a little bit on him as a genius. You know, you hear that word sort of tossed around, but it seems understood that Oppenheimer was a genius in the truest sense of the word. Of course, in physics and you know, even as a very precocious child, and his rock collection and giving his speech at the Mineral Society, and you know, these types of anecdotes that we read about, finishing Harvard in 3 years. But can you explain a little bit about how broad his interests were, or touching on his poetry, his Hindu scripture?
Yes. Well, I sort of, Marty and I argued in the book that he was a very good, brilliant physicist, in part precisely because he was such a polymath and he was so curious about everything. You know, as a young boy, he had a rock collection. He was into building blocks, and as a teenager, he excelled in chemistry. But he also was interested in literature. And, you know, as a young man in his 20s, he was reading Ernest Hemingway novels, and he fell in love with French poetry. And later, as a physics professor at Berkeley, he became curious about the Hindu scriptures and the Gita, so much so that he decided to get private tutoring in Sanskrit so that he could learn to read the Gita in the original. I don't know how many people are capable of doing that. You know, he was just endless curiosity about the world. And this is precisely why he was picked, I think, by General Groves to be the scientific director of the Los Alamos project, because Groves understood that this was a very ambitious young man in his late 30s who was eager to contribute to the war effort, and was a brilliant physicist who had just recently predicted, on the basis of theoretical physics, the existence of black holes. But Groves was someone who didn't understand physics at all, and yet he understood that Robert was someone who could talk to him in plain English. And it was a brilliant choice, but precisely because he was not just a nerdy physicist. He, was sensitive. He was a philosopher.
Tim, can you kind of talk a little bit about Oppenheimer as a leader, maybe from what you would suppose would be your parents' perspective? You know, you had commented earlier on they adored him, and that's a common sentiment that we often hear when it comes to those students, staff, anyone from the Manhattan Project seem to just want to follow him to the end of the earth. I think that's a quote from one of his proteges. What did you have to say?
As Kai's book shows, he was an amazing teacher, which he wasn't at the beginning, but he became an incredibly inspiring teacher. He was obviously a person of exceptional brilliance. He had the ability, it seems, and most of this I get from Kai's book, to see multiple steps ahead of everybody else. And so he not only understood the mathematics and the science, but he also had this incredibly creative mind and the ability to apply his scientific expertise to ideas that most people were incapable of. And so, for that reason, I think people who were scientists were just so in awe of him and his ability to help them understand concepts that, only someone of his incredible intellect could envision, and through the use of theoretical physics, articulate or demonstrate. And so, he, as Kai says, he was a complicated person in so many ways, but with incredible abilities. He learned multiple languages in what seems like the speed of light. He was only in his late 30s when he was tasked with this responsibility. And by then, he had accomplished enormous things in the classroom. There was really there were few, if any, people who could have matched his spectrum of intellectual and emotional skills and talents and knowledge. And so, people wonder if could somebody else have accomplished what he had and led the Manhattan Project and succeeded in the way that he did. And, Groves asked that question, and nobody could come up with anybody. And I think looking back, there was nobody who could have done what he did.
Why do you think that is? We're hearing about his brilliance, his ambition, and his drive, and then I suppose his ability to inspire, to be an inspirational leader. Is this sort of the trifecta that made him truly the only person who could accomplish his task of building the atomic bomb in such a short time period?
Well, they could have, Groves could have chosen Ernest Lawrence or any number of other prominent physicists who had won a Nobel already. But it probably would have been a mistake. And Oppenheimer, I would argue, if you look at also, we devote many pages to trying to explain his political evolution in the 1920s and 30s. From being totally apolitical in the 20s to, in the 1930s, becoming more and more aware of the Depression and the world conflicts and the Spanish Civil War. And part of his political awareness was being developed by his encounters with certain women who were frustrated that he wasn't more involved in the world. So I'm speaking specifically of Jean Tatlock, who he fell in love with in the mid-1930s and whom he proposed marriage to. And Jean Tatlock was a intellectual and who was studying, and very rare in those days, but as a woman, she was studying to be a doctor or a psychiatrist. But she also happened to be a member of the Communist Party. And she wanted Oppie to be more involved in the world. If not join the party, she wanted him to be involved in projects supported by the party, like raising money to send an ambulance to the Spanish Republic in the midst of the Civil War, or helping to organize the people to oppose segregation in the public swimming pool in Berkeley, or helping farm workers. And Oppie, was aware that he should be, that he was deficient, that he wasn't involved enough in the world. And I think that also gave him a motivation for working on the gadget, because he feared deeply the possibility of a victory by fascism in Europe. And this gave him his motivation. He feared that the Germans were 18 months ahead in the race to build the gadget, and that German physicists whom he had studied with in Germany as a young man studying quantum physics, he feared that, he knew that they were just as capable as he was, and so he assumed that they were far ahead in the project. And I think Groves could see in Oppie this ambition, this drive to contribute something. He was desperate to contribute, and Groves could see that, and I think that's one of the reasons. Although the other reason was that Oppie, in their pivotal meeting, Oppie sort of, he could be very charming when he wanted to. And he made the argument to Groves that instead of scattering the project all over the country in different laboratories, what you needed to do is bring everyone working on the project to one place and put a piece of barbed wire fence around to keep everything secure and allow all the scientists to talk freely to each other inside that secret city. And by the way, he had an idea for exactly where this should be happening, New Mexico. Because as he had told his younger brother Frank, his ambition, this was long before Los Alamos, his ambition, he told Frank, in life was to somehow find a way to combine his love of physics with his love of New Mexico. And what more brilliant way to do that than to pitch to Groves, I know a place called Los Alamos. And Groves responded to that. He liked the idea because it fit with his security needs. And he was won over by the argument that you put everyone in one place and they collaborate. And of course, that's what the culture here at Los Alamos as a lab, it has historically all been about. It's been about collaboration and getting different kinds of scientists to work together. So.
And what about the actual environment? We have, in the NSRC, we have footage of the scientists skiing down Pajarito or going on hikes, horseback riding. Do you think that the environment affected, surely Oppenheimer, but also the physicists on his staff and others?
Well, Robert understood that to motivate people to work hard, to go spend long hours, you also had to inspire them with the notion that they could party hard. So he was all for building the ski slope and long treks in the canyons and horseback riding and parties where he would invite people over to the Oppenheimer house and mix his lethal martinis, gin martinis, with that god-awful recipe of honey, my opinion. But yeah, so he would invite people over, and everyone loved to have an invitation to sip one of those martinis with the director. And so he was brilliant at being charismatic, and his style of leadership was, he was very soft-spoken, and typically his style was to stand in the back of the room and listen and let people argue and be unobtrusive and then he would, at just the right moment, he would step forth and summarize what everyone was saying from different points of view and point the way forward and suggest, well, this is the next step to explore this. This is how we're going to experiment and find out what is the right next step. And people would nod and agree. And he was, he wasn't divisive. And his style was very democratic. So he was brilliant.
Tim, a question for you, and same question for Kai as a follow-up. Was he a hero?
Was he a hero?
Yes.
That's a word that's so overused today. But clearly what he accomplished was, unlike anything that had happened before in history. And I think that the way he went about it, as Kai just described, the way he inspired people, his own brilliance and how he brought it to others and inspired them. I think that given how overused that term is today, he would certainly qualify. But I'm not sure he would think of himself in that way at all. And yet, as we look back, what he achieved was so remarkable. When you think about arriving here where there was virtually nothing, and 27 months later, they have created this laboratory and brought scientists from all over the world through his charisma and solicitation and personal relationships, and solved this problem that no one had ever achieved before. I think that pretty well qualifies.
Okay, same question. Was he a hero, or is there another word that you would use to describe him?
Well, I think Oppenheimer would have cringed at the word. I mean, he was too smart to take on that label. And again, he was more aware of his own fragility psychologically and physically, and therefore aware of other people's vulnerabilities. And so he would have ducked the idea of being a hero. On the other hand, what is sort of infuriating about Oppenheimer is that he did have this sort of theatrical streak to him. He could be very dramatic. So when at the Trinity test, he's with Frank, his brother, who he was devoted to, and the bomb goes off, and what does Oppenheimer say? He turns to Frank and he simply says, "It worked." But the next day or the day after, he's being interviewed by a New York Times reporter who's been sent to do an account later on after Hiroshima of what had been taking place in Los Alamos. And the reporter, Lawrence was his name, asked him, "Well, Dr. Oppenheimer, what went through your mind when you saw the flash from the Trinity test?" And Oppie very dramatically dredged out this scripture from the Gita saying, "Well, it reminded me of the line in the Gita, 'I am death, destroyer of worlds.'" I mean, it was very, very theatrical. And Oppie had an understanding that he had become a celebrity. I mean, after 1945, he became a very famous man. His image was put on the cover of Time and Life, and he appreciated the power that gave him. And Kitty, his wife, loved it. She would have called him a hero. But Oppie had this notion that he should use his celebrity status as a scientist to have influence, and to have influence in Washington. But part of that, I think, was he fell in love with the idea of being a member of the establishment. And so maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but when he was about to go down to the 1954 security hearing, he walks into the office down the hall, in the office of Albert Einstein. Oppie was his boss at that point, as director of the Institute for Advanced Study. And he tells Albert, I have to go down to Washington for some weeks. They're going to be interrogating me about my loyalty to the country and questioning my ability to retain a security clearance. And Einstein looks at him and says, "Robert, you're Dr. Atomic." Well, if they don't want you, just walk away. And Oppenheimer looked at him and said, "No, you don't understand, Albert. I need to use my influence to teach people in Washington about how to live with the bomb. And I need a security clearance to do this." And So Robert walks out, and Einstein, as he's walking out, he turns to his secretary and he says, "There goes a nar," the Yiddish word for fool. And he was being foolish, he was being naive about the politics, about the political storm that he was about to run into. And Einstein was right, but Oppie was enthralled with being in the halls of the Senate and hobnobbing with senators and having a meeting in the Oval Office with President Truman, and he wanted to retain that. And of course, that ambition was a weakness that contributed to his downfall.
Before we talk a little bit more about the downfall, the fallen hero narrative, can you talk about the influence of his family members? You mentioned his brother, his wife Kitty. He was a father, he had a son and a daughter. Can you discuss that?
Yeah, well, Kitty is a wonderful character in the book, and I think the movie, and that we're all about to see. And Kitty is vivacious and outgoing, and struggles here in Los Alamos with this Spartan culture, but she's actually a rock during the trial, and is a tiger in defending her husband at a time when he gets up on the witness stand and is not able to. Oddly enough, he's sort of unable to defend himself against these unfair questioning. But Kitty was, a difficult, demanding woman, and Oppie, they had a long marriage. It had its rocks and mountains, but he stuck with her and she stuck with him, and they had 2 kids. They arrived here in Los Alamos with Peter, who had just been born in 1940. A little prematurely, Oppie for a while referred to him as Pronto. Because he had appeared soon after Kitty had fallen in love with Robert. And anyway, and then Tony arrived in 1944, and walking through that house today, I was struck by how quaint and beautiful it is, but small. There are the 2 kids in that little house, and Robert, and no kitchen initially, and it was a difficult life for Kitty. And Peter, I think, Peter's still with us. He lives in Santa Fe, and he's extremely reticent. I once interviewed him and got virtually nothing out of him, but got a sense of who he was. But I think he was 14 years old when the 1954 hearing took place, and I think he was traumatized by it. He was old enough to understand, painfully to understand what his father was going through and what people were saying about his father. And then Tony, I should mention just Tony briefly, but she was born in 1944, and she too, I won't speak about it, but she too had a sad ending that was tragic and somewhat related to the story of her father, and it sort of underscores the difficulty that children have growing up in the shadow of famous parents.
Let's transition to the hearings of 1954. Tim, would you like to sort of set the scene for us?
Actually, Kai is better at setting scenes, but
You tell her about it.
I mentioned that my parents were here, and their reverence for Robert Oppenheimer. They also rode horses and would hike down into the canyons, and I have photographs of that. So they clearly made as much of being here as they could, not just laboring in the laboratory or at the nursery school, but also the scenery and the topography and the archaeology and all of that was really important to them, and they brought us back here for that reason. I got involved, though, in this in part because of the stories they told me about Oppenheimer, but mostly because of Kai, who I had known for many years before he wrote this book, and him coming to me and describing what had happened to Robert Oppenheimer in 1954. I didn't know anything about it, and I suspect 95% of Americans know nothing about it. They remember Oppenheimer as the father of the atomic bomb, but as Kai has described, he was much, much more than that. And what happened in 1994, or rather as Kai described it, and efforts that he and Marty Sherwin had undertaken previously to try to convince the Department of Energy to nullify the decision of the Atomic Energy Commission because it was based on a hearing that was so patently unfair and unethical and illegal in the way that Oppenheimer was mistreated and subjected to humiliation in ways that nobody should have, and certainly not him, given his contribution to the war effort. And yet, those efforts had not succeeded. Kai could speak more to that. And it was really then in the early 2000s that the J. Robert Oppenheimer Memorial Committee tried to interest people in Washington of the need to address this miscarriage of justice. In fact, in the weeks after the hearing, hundreds of scientists from Los Alamos and elsewhere signed a petition urging the Atomic Energy Commission to reverse their decision to no avail. And then in, I think, 2011, Senator Bingaman, formerly a senator from New Mexico, wrote a long letter to then Secretary of Energy Chu, laying out the case for why what had happened and what really was a conspiracy to humiliate and to discredit Oppenheimer had no basis in fact, and that the hearing would be condemned today for violating every semblance of due process. But unfortunately, Bingaman retired, and so Secretary Chu never got around to acting on that request. I can continue, but I don't want to dominate the story here. What happened next was that because of Kai coming to me and also me reading the chapters in the book about the hearing, this was not something that I would normally do. My job in the Senate was foreign policy and appropriations, and it's fair to say that Robert Oppenheimer didn't really fit in my job description. But I had this personal connection because of my parents. And I also worked for a senator, Senator Leahy, who was the chairman of our Judiciary Committee. And I had been a public defender, he had been a prosecutor. And so we both had quite strong views about the importance of both due process and the rights of people who are accused, and also the need to address abuses of power by government officials. And so, really by virtue of the position that I had in the Congress, I felt that I should, thanks to Kai, try to learn more about this and see if there was any way that we could convince the Department of Energy to recognize just how wrong it was what was done to Oppenheimer, and that it was important to set the record straight, that hearing should not have been the last word in the professional life of Robert Oppenheimer. And so I wrote a letter with Kai's help addressed to President Obama, 3 other senators in addition to Senator Leahy, one of whom was the senator from New Mexico, one of the senators, Martin Heinrich, and sent it off to the White House, and then heard nothing. And months went by, and eventually what we heard was that it had been forwarded to the Department of Energy. At the time, Ernest Moniz was the secretary, a nuclear physicist, who one would think, if anyone, would recognize the need to do something about this, it would be him. And I think, based on what I've been led to believe, he wanted to. But I think he got very poor advice from his staff, and particularly his lawyers, who in retrospect didn't really understand what we were asking of him. And so instead of what we had wanted, which was to vacate the decision and to definitively repudiate the miscarriage of justice against Robert Oppenheimer by the Atomic Energy Commission, that he named a fellowship in Oppenheimer's name, which really wasn't what we were interested in.
Well, I was really disappointed.
Yeah, I mean, it was like, really? That's, so, that was really unfortunate, because we felt that, if there was anyone who would likely agree with us, it would be Secretary Moniz. So then, Donald Trump was elected, and we knew that we were not going to convince him to do anything to set the record straight about J. Robert Oppenheimer. But 4 years later, when President Biden was elected, I felt we should resurrect this, and I talked with Senator Leahy about it, and we sent another letter, similar to our previous one to President Obama, and sent this one to President Biden, with the same 4 senators signing it. And again, waited. Several months went by. But in the interim, and this is sort of one of those serendipitous aspects of this, I had bought a ping pong table on Craigslist. So I had no idea who I was buying it from, but it turned out to be another Senate staff person like myself, who worked for Senator Franklin. And he was a scientist, and I got to know him. And later he became the director of the Federation of American Scientists. And then a year or so later was appointed to be an assistant secretary in the Department of Energy. So, having not heard anything, I finally called him up and I said, hey, we sent this letter. Here's why it's important. Can you find out what happened to it? Are we going to get an answer? And so a few days later, he called me back and said, I found the letter, but I don't think you're going to like the answer. I think you're going to get the same answer. So I said, well, then don't answer it. I'm going to write a different one. And the fact that I had him to ask that question of was really critical, because if we had gotten the wrong answer from the Biden administration, that would have probably been the end of it.
So it was all about the ping pong table.
Yes, that ping pong table turned out to be really important. So I then spent literally the next 7 months rewriting the letter. And Kai helped me. It went through 50 drafts. And what we recognized was that a couple of things. One was, we weren't asking, although we felt Robert Oppenheimer's clearance should never have been revoked. There was no basis for revoking his security clearance. He was a loyal American. He had never divulged any secrets. He clearly was motivated by the mission to defeat the Nazis, and there was nothing about his character or his conduct that justified revoking his security clearance. But we also recognized that we could not restore his security clearance because he had been dead for 50 years. And that the only thing we could do was to nullify the decision based on that flawed hearing. It wouldn't reinstate his security clearance, but it would at least make clear that the way he had been treated was wrong and unconscionable, and that the government needed to make that clear. So, unlike Moniz, I think it was under the misimpression that what we were asking for was that Oppenheimer's security clearance be restored, and there's a whole other story as to why he was reluctant to do that. That's not really what we were asking for, as much as we would have liked to, because that would have required another hearing, a fair hearing, a hearing where Oppenheimer's rights were protected, where he and his lawyers' conversations weren't being wiretapped, where all kinds of unethical conduct by the prosecutors would not be permitted, and who knows what the outcome would have been, but it would have been a very, very different process. So that took quite a bit of effort to rewrite the letter in a way that addressed some of the issues that were concerning, and to make very clear what it was we were asking for and what it was we were not asking for. The other thing that I felt strongly about was that we needed to somehow make this relevant to today, because injustices happen every day, all over the world. And, we need to explain why this one is one that should really necessitate the action that we were asking for. And to do that, I felt we needed to be able to explain to the Secretary of Energy that this was not just about Robert Oppenheimer and the way he was mistreated, but also it was about the importance of reaffirming the ability of scientists to debate controversial issues, to express views which are not necessarily consistent with the conventional wisdom, and not fear that they're going to be attacked, that their careers are going to be in jeopardy, that their characters are going to be subject to character assassination, and that, particularly at a time when we saw during the COVID pandemic, scientists being ridiculed and vilified, and science itself being treated as not important or unreliable or politicized in ways that really, I think all of us in this room recognize how dangerous that is. And so, Senator Leahy and I wanted to be sure that the Secretary understood that it was really her responsibility to use the Oppenheimer case to reaffirm that principle of the importance of science, of facts, of freedom of expression, of transparency, and the ability of scientists without fear of retaliation to express views that might not be necessarily in line with conventional wisdom. And so, that letter took a lot of effort, but in the end, we were able to convince 43 senators to sign it. And that was both Republicans and Democrats. Getting 43 United States senators to sign anything is not, it rarely happens, let me just tell you. And particularly about something as, that was really kind of ancient history. for most people. So, Senator Leahy really, and I worked very hard at that, and it took a long time. But I also felt that this was probably going to be our last chance to address this issue. There had been repeated attempts for over 70 years. They had all failed, and that if we couldn't prevail this time, I doubted that anyone was going to devote anywhere near the amount of time that I did to this. So, or would have the reason to, the motivation, because, for me it was also a personal thing. But I also felt that even 43 senators probably wasn't enough. So, because the Secretary of Energy today isn't a scientist. She was the former governor of Michigan. She's a really fine person and a lawyer. But, I worried that her first question to her staff would be, well, if Moniz didn't do this, why would I do this? And so I really felt we had to give her every possible reason to make it as easy as possible for her to make the right decision. Because I also assumed there were people in the Department of Energy who wouldn't support it. So that was what led me to contact, ultimately, Tom Mason here at Los Alamos, who I'd never heard of. I didn't know him. And actually, I doubted that the current director of the lab would feel that he could express a view on this. But it turned out that he had, when he was director at Oak Ridge, he had actually weighed in previous attempts. And so he was open to it. We had some different perspectives about what we should be asking for, but ultimately he was able to write a letter which largely mirrored the letter by the senators and convinced all the living former directors of Los Alamos National Laboratory to sign it. And that was just hugely important to us because it gave credibility to what we were asking for from people who really were from the scientific community, weren't just politicians. I also then reached out to the director of the Idaho National Lab. I didn't even know there was a national lab. But I tracked him down and I explained what we were doing, and he also was willing to send a letter in support. And I then contacted the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. My father, like Oppenheimer, was very concerned about the proliferation of atomic weapons and really devoted much of the rest of his life to trying to educate people about the dangers of nuclear weapons and the need to try to control their use. And so he became the chairman of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists up until the time he died. And he was the person who would move the hands of that doomsday clock. So the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists also sent a letter supporting what we were asking for, as did the American Physical Society. And when I contacted the American Physical Society, I had no idea what they were. But I found out it was a society of physicists. So that was a logical place to ask. And they also wrote a letter, as did the Federation of American Scientists. And Kai and Richard Rhodes, the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Making of the Atomic Bomb, also sent a letter. And I put all this in a binder and got on my bicycle and rode down to the Department of Energy because I didn't want it to get lost in the mail after the amount of time that I had put into this. And I gave it to the person that I referenced, and I said, okay, here it is, and she better make the right decision. I didn't hear anything for a month. So I emailed him. Kai was asking me if you heard anything, and nothing yet. And another month went by, and I was getting kind of worried because Senator Leahy was going to retire at the end of that year, and I really wanted this to happen while he was still in the Senate. And finally, what I was told was, well, I think she's going to make the right decision. And so I said, well, before she does, I want to know what she's going to say, because we don't want to go through this again. It has to be unequivocal, no, completely unambiguous. It must set the record straight once and for all for eternity. And that there is no basis for questioning her decision or challenging it. And so I think it was in December, finally. I think I had handed over this material to the Department of Energy in August. And so maybe it was September. In any event, it seemed like a long time. And finally, I got this call. And he said, she's going to vacate the decision. And I said, well, tell me what she's going to say. And he read her statement to me over the phone. And it was better than I could have written myself. And then I wanted Senator Leahy to thank her for doing this, because we knew that it was not an easy thing for any secretary to do. You know, in Washington, it's very easy to say no to anything. You know, to sort of pick the path of least resistance. And it's not like she needed to do this, really. But I think she recognized, and when we set up this phone call for her and Senator Leahy was delayed a bit, so I was talking to her. And she said, you know, I knew almost immediately that I wanted to do this. But I just wanted to be sure of all the facts. And so she read the book, 600 pages. Not many cabinet secretaries have done that. And so she deserves a great deal of credit for the step that she took, so that at least that hearing is not the last word in the life of Robert Oppenheimer. And you know, I think that should matter to all of us.
So I just want to reiterate that the ping pong table was very important. And that Tim took the effort to bicycle down, physically hand over all these petitions and letters. It wouldn't have happened without Tim.
Kai, a follow-up question for you. Do you remember where you were when you heard the news that Secretary Granholm was going to vacate the decision, and what went through your mind?
Well, I was at home working on my next book. I'm writing a biography of Roy Cohn. Oh no, that's what everyone says. And I get this call from Tim, and he says, she did it. And it was unbelievable. I was shocked and surprised and relieved. We'd worked so hard on this, and Tim had called me up so many times to rewrite this damn letter. But it also, I was, touched that, Marty Sherwin had died in October of 21 at the age of 84, but he, after American Prometheus came out in 2005, it was he who came to me and said, we ought to try to summarize the case in a memo. And he sat down and wrote a 5-page and a 10-page memo chronicling all the crimes and misdemeanors that Louis Strauss had committed in that hearing against Oppenheimer. And that became the basis for the letter that we eventually wrote to first Obama and then Biden. But earlier, before Tim became involved, just a small anecdote, we initially thought, well, maybe we should seek a redress in the courts. And so soon after American Prometheus came out, we approached a powerful law firm in Washington, D.C., and we had in there someone we knew and made the pitch, will you assign a young associate to work pro bono to see if there was anything that could be done in the courts to rectify this. And they agreed, and pro bono work, that was terrific. And about 3 months later, we got a call from this lawyer very sheepishly apologizing that they were going to have to withdraw because one of their senior partners was objecting. And his name, the senior partner's name, was C. Boyden Gray. And he just happened to be the son of Gordon Gray, who was the chairman of the panel that had convicted Oppenheimer. And he didn't want his law firm to be involved in exonerating Oppenheimer and blackening, in his view, the name of his own father. So, Washington is a small town. You have to be careful.
Okay. One more question before we open it up to the audience to ask their questions. Is it true, Kai, that Christopher Nolan is making a movie?
I've heard rumors of
I've
this.
also heard that. And have you met Matt Damon?
No, I have never met Matt Damon, but I was invited here to Los Alamos with my wife Susan to be on the film set for a few hours, and we met Cillian Murphy. And he walked up to me to be introduced, and I took the initiative and I said, Dr. Oppenheimer, I've been waiting decades to meet you. He's dressed in this 1940s baggy suit and a colorful white tie, and he was wearing the hat. And he had those bright blue eyes, and I think he's a very good Oppenheimer.
Okay, quickly, could you please also share the screening story that Christopher Nolan brought you to the IMAX theater to show you your words on the big screen in motion picture?
Yeah, it was an experience. Just a few weeks ago, they very graciously Nolan called me up and said it's time for me to see the movie. And they flew me out to LA, and the next morning I was walked into a completely empty IMAX theater. Huge IMAX theater. And Nolan told me where exactly to sit in the middle of the theater for the best experience, and he very diplomatically adjourned to the far end, the last seat in the row, 30 or 40 seats away, and gave me space to see this in private. It's an amazing film artistically, and it's shot in IMAX in color and also IMAX in black and white, and it goes back and forth, and it's almost 3 hours, and I think it's faithful to the book. I was really impressed. It's deeply biographical, and anyone who's read the book will recognize the movie and vice versa.
Alrighty, well, that concludes our evening, but we are going to open it up for questions, so go ahead and raise your hands.
I was wondering if either of you had any comment on the parallelism between what happened to Oppenheimer and what happened to Sakharov, since both of them recognized the dangers of what they had constructed and were very concerned about controlling it.
Well, I think that's a good question, an interesting parallel. physicists dealing with things atomic get in trouble with the authorities. It's not, I think it's not unusual that Sakharov became a dissident. Oppenheimer was not quite a dissident. As I explained, he was very much someone who wanted to be a part of the establishment, but he was being expelled from it. And he was being expelled precisely for his sort of dissents on national defense policy. He thought it was unnecessary to build up a huge nuclear arsenal. And he had views in a way similar to Sakharov's dissident views against the Soviet Union's reliance on weapons of mass destruction. And, Oppenheimer's vision was, even 3 months after Hiroshima, he was giving famously a talk in Philadelphia in which he is, you can listen to this on the web, just Google it, and he gives this amazing speech in that soft, eerie voice of his in which he describes the weapon as cheap. And any country, however poor, who wants to build these weapons will be able to do so. There are no secrets. The physics is known. And they are weapons for aggressors, and they are weapons of terror, and they were weapons that were used on an already essentially defeated enemy. And that's an astonishing series of things to say from the mouth of the father of the atomic bomb. But he was, soon after Hiroshima, he began thinking about the consequences and thinking, he had no regrets about what he had done. He had done it to defeat German fascism. He knew that you cannot stop science, you cannot stop human beings from wondering about the physical world around them, and so the physics was going to be found out, that vision was going to be found out, and but he thought it was important to learn how to live with the bomb, learn how to regulate it, and he was trying to go around arguing that we needed an international atomic authority that would essentially ban the bomb and have sovereign inspection authorities to go anywhere in the world to inspect laboratories or factories and to monitor scientists around the world to prevent them from building these weapons. And he wanted the powers that be in Moscow and Washington to come to arms control agreements. And of course, we've gone down that road a great deal. We do have an International Atomic Energy Agency that is trying to monitor laboratories around the world, and it's just that his full vision hasn't been realized, and instead, countries like North Korea and Pakistan and India and Israel and soon Iran have developed, soon will develop these weapons. And the story of the atomic age may have begun at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but it's not over. We don't know the ending. And that's a little scary, and he worried about this. I don't want to go on too long, but here's one more little anecdote that I always love telling, that I told so often when we were on book tour, Marty and I, in 2005, that Marty just groaned when I said, "Oh, here it comes." But I think it's a wonderful story about Oppie and his personality. In 1949, he's called before the Senate to testify, and he's asked by a senator, about the possibility of, is it possible, and what would the defense be if the Russians were to sneak an atomic device, a gadget, aboard a ship and run it into New York Harbor? What's the defense? And Dr. Oppenheimer replied, he could be quite flippant. He said, get a screwdriver. and open up every box and every suitcase that arrives in New York Harbor. No, there is no defense. Now, he was being slightly facetious, but his answer was an attempt to get people to wake up to the threat of lone actors, terrorists, using a dirty bomb, and we're still living with this today. And, you know, Oppenheimer was trying to use, as I said earlier, he had a theatrical streak to him, so get a screwdriver. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he was trying to initiate a conversation about how to live with the bomb. And we're still trying to do that to this day. I think that's why the book is having a second life, and why the film is going to, I hope, start a national conversation about our history with the atomic age and McCarthyism and what happened to Robert Oppenheimer in 1954.
I have a question. You mentioned that Oppenheimer's lawyer's office was bugged. Do you know or suspect that Oppenheimer's office or home was bugged?
Oh, we know it was bugged. We have transcripts.
Thousands of
There are 8,000 pages of FBI documents, and you can see the agents summarizing some of those transcripts from the bugs. And yeah, his home in Princeton was bugged, and Kitty knew it, and she would sometimes yell at the telephone. And but yeah, so it was outrageous. He was under surveillance starting in 1940, very fleetingly, but for much of his life in the late 40s, mid 40s, late 40s, early 50s, even late 50s, he was subject to all sorts of surveillance.
So I wanted to thank both of you, I guess, publicly for what you did on behalf of the reputation of Mr. Los Alamos. He's our patron saint. We have Oppenheimer Drive. We have Oppenheimer IPA. We have bobbleheads. But my serious questions go back, and you mentioned McCarthyism. So I thought that might be interesting to hear from both of you, kind of the political context that permitted something like this to happen. Are there any lessons learned by not just the public and what we did here, what we're seeing here, but in terms of parallels, and to try to avoid these types of things from happening in the future? So I'd be interested in hearing from you about that.
Well, one thing we seem to be not good at is learning from past mistakes. And, if you read Kai's book, you'll learn a lot about how, Kai and Marty's book, you'll learn a lot about how the McCarthy era factored into what happened to Robert Oppenheimer. It was clearly a major factor and sort of provided the context for really the conspiracy that was orchestrated against him on the basis of all kinds of misdeeds. But I think we've seen recently how easy it would be for something like that to happen again. And I think that we know what we have to do to prevent that. We know that we have to have strong institutions, checks and balances, an independent judiciary, procedures that ensure that people are accountable, that there's transparency in the way decisions get made, and that people cannot just in positions of authority abuse that authority in ways that destroy the character and the reputation of loyal American patriots, which is really what Robert Oppenheimer was. So I think there are clearly lessons from that period that we need to learn. I just think that as we've seen in recent years, we're not that far from making similar mistakes. And all the more reason why I at least felt that it was important, and Secretary Granholm makes this point very strongly in her statement, that the importance of scientific freedom and transparency and accountability and just as a lawyer herself, I think, due process be recognized as critically important, and it's our job to defend those principles.
I was going to ask, do you think that the theatrical streaks, as you call them, for example, the conflicting accounts of his reactions to the Trinity test, do you think that those were a result of insincerity, or do you think they were a result of, or a physical, or like a manifestation of his, internal turmoil?
Internal.
Turmoil.
Oh. No, I think what he said was it worked. It was, and that's what I think all of us, our first response would have been. But he did understand that when being interviewed by a reporter on this occasion, maybe something more quotable was required. And so he was a very reticent, shy person in many ways, but he had grown into this job. He was the director, a very popular, charismatic director, and he understood that a platform was being offered to him, and so he was taking the occasion to try to say something memorable. Now, at the same time, I think, the quote he chose is deeply philosophical and enigmatic, and yes, it reflects his own sort of ambiguous relationship to the bomb. He was painfully aware that there were going to be victims, and they were going to be civilians and women and children, and this deeply troubled him. So it's a combination of all of that, I think.
Any other questions? I'll come back to you, Val, in the back.
Hi. So my question is that we have evidence, that Oppenheimer visited a lab in the time it was directors who kind of got to see what Los Alamos was turning into during the Cold War period. And I know that asking biographers what historical figure would have felt of the current is kind of an unfair question, but that's always been as someone who is here in the current, has always been one of the questions I've always had about Oppenheimer. So I guess my question to you is, knowing so much about Oppenheimer as a person, as a director, as a scientist, what would you think he would make of Los Alamos now, both as a laboratory and also just as a community, seeing how much we've grown, especially in the last 5 to 10 years? And what would he say if he were to visit us today?
Well, this is all speculation, as you say, but historians do speculate with counterfactuals, as they call them. What if? But clearly, Oppie decided quickly that he no longer wanted to be director at Los Alamos. He wanted to move on. He no longer wanted to work on weapons of mass destruction. Indeed, we know from Kitty's letters to friends that right after the news of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that Robert, as she called him, plunged into a rather deep depression. I think today he would have been proud of all the science, but saddened that we're still relying on these weapons of mass destruction, that we still have to build more, modernize them. And he'd be horrified at the notion that we're fighting another war in Europe and on the land today, and that Mr. Putin is threatening to use evidently tactical nuclear weapons. And I think he would have still argued that these are weapons of terror, that they're not military weapons. He would have understood the argument about that they're weapons of deterrence, but Mr. Putin is talking about using them on a battlefield, and they are not battlefield weapons. They are weapons of terror, and if Putin ever was to use them in the Ukraine, the purpose would be psychological, to terrify people and terrify policymakers in Washington, and you know, he would have been horrified and saddened by where we are today, I think.
My questions are going to follow on very much with what you were just talking about. Tonight, Sig Hecker is giving a talk on the changing nature of the nuclear system that we have been operating under decades. He's clearly getting, engaging now already in the same things you were just discussing. Do you have an interest in continuing to follow this, or have you, as Oppenheimer did, want to set aside what you've done a splendid job dealing with? Because there's going to be a significant need for a national dialogue to be recreated on the subject.
Would I personally wish to participate in a dialogue?
But follow it on as a new area that relates to what you've already done with your job.
Well, sure, but I'm not quite sure what I can contribute, but, as I said, my next book is on Roy Cohn, and I'm still researching it. Or rather, I should say my wife Susan is researching it. I'm out on the road now talking about Oppenheimer, so I'm already being diverted. But, so yeah, sure.
Any other questions?
A question for Tim. These letters you wrote and the letters that the directors wrote, where are they archived and are they accessible online?
I doubt that they are accessible online. I have a file with all of that material. And it will be part of Senator Leahy's archives. So it will be accessible to the public. And I think, what I've told people is that those who want to see what we did and what others wrote, I think there's no reason that shouldn't be made available. The Secretary's statement was a public statement and summarized very well what our letters tried to convey. And so you can't go to, I don't think you can go to Google and type in and look for these letters, but they will be available over time, and certainly if anyone wants to read them, they can email me.
I saw another hand up. Yeah. Skip.
Yes, what would he have thought of today? Set my thinking. Did he ever express any concern about nuclear waste and how it has proliferated and how it looks like we're going to proliferate a lot more as we try to get off of gas and oil?
I think we know he was optimistic about the future of nuclear energy. and he thought it was practical and scientifically possible and safe. And but I don't think I've ever seen any documentation showing his worries about the issue of waste and how to store it and such. It was maybe it was too early in the debate as such for him to, but yeah, I don't know what he would, where his position would be today, but you know, he was a good scientist and smart, and he would have figured out that there are problems, but and I think we need to have a public debate precisely about this. And look at all the environmental factors and the social costs, and to try to figure out if we're going to go down the route of relying on nuclear energy more in the future, precisely because we don't want fossil fuel, then how are we going to solve the problem of waste? And I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. So.
Anyone else here?
Please settle the question once and for all. What does the J stand for in his name?
Well, yeah, it's sort of a mystery, but my memory is that Marty and I decided that it was Julius, his father, but you know, he did come from a Jewish tradition, and in the Jewish tradition, you're not supposed to name your son after a living father. But I think the J obviously stands for Julius, but he never used it. They always called him Robert. So, I don't know. My name is, I'm known as Kai Berg, but actually I have a first name that my parents never used, and I never used it. And so I'm Kai, and he was Robert. But in my mind, he was always Oppie.
Same with my parents.
Anyone else? Oh, one more.
I guess I feel like we in Los Alamos would like to think that Oppie might maybe be astonished and even gratified that nuclear weapons have not been used again in warfare for all these many years, 80 years, and that there are far fewer nuclear warheads on planet Earth now than there were during the Cold War. So arms reduction treaties have been successful to a point. I hope that would have made him happy.
Yes, I quite agree.
All right, anyone else? All righty, well, I must thank